In Dovima's time, physical beauty and poise were of utmost importance in the fashion industry. She was fighting at only 16 years old and had been discovered on Madison Avenue and on the cover of Glamour magazine in 1949. A meeting with notorious fashion photographer Avedon was the beginning of her career, and his pictures of her are the most well-known and captivating of his work. The two icons created a distinctive style for the era. She was the living embodiment of his desire to portray dark-haired, sophisticated beauties with the allure of luxury and wealth. His most famous pictures were of her. His pictures of Dovima led to his most successful and high-paid years at Vogue and changed the course of her life, leading to a glamorous 15-year career on both sides of the Atlantic. During her career, Dovima had modeled for all the great designers of the time such as Dior, Balenciaga, and Givenchy. She traveled the world and made significant amounts of money. Her face was known to everyone. The idea of luxury had always been a strong force throughout Dovima's life. She had left her hometown of Queens to live in Manhattan with her family at a young age. Throughout her career as a model, she spent a great deal of time in Europe. Dovima enjoyed her time there and was content, but always had a yearning to live in a Swiss chalet. She thought that living in such a way would ensure that her children could have the best upbringing and education possible. This would be a way of securing a better life for her family. Unfortunately, Dovima's glamorous lifestyle and spending habits were motivated by an unstable childhood and a deep-seated fear of poverty. She had quickly spent through most of her earnings from modeling and had sent very little back to provide for her children, who had been left in the care of their grandmother. Dovima was raised in New York City with the given name Dorothy Virginia Margaret Juba to a poor family. Throughout her childhood, Dovima and her family endured poverty, and it was this early life which subsequently fashioned Dovima's drive and ambition to raise herself and her family from it. Bonded with her father, who was his daughter's advocate for success, Dovima was pushed to excel in school and was encouraged to write her speech and refine her mannerisms and develop an initial interest in art. Growing up, Dorothy was an avid fan of the cinema, and Dovima often went to the theaters and watched excitedly as the movies of the time portrayed women looking elegant, glamorous, and worry-free while snaring the perfect mate and living the perfect lifestyle. This, at the time, was a facade given the conditions of the Great Depression and WWII, but it endeared women like Dovima to want to exit her life and pursue such a lifestyle of glamour and elegance. This childhood desire was to be portrayed later on in her modeling career and continued to fuel her ambition throughout her life. During high school, Dovima excelled and learned the skills necessary to change her life. The allure of wealth and glamour is hard to resist, and considering this was Warhol's era, very little has changed concerning popular culture to this day. When the fashion industry boomed in 1947, Dovima was 21 and quickly squeezed herself into the corset of couture modeling. I think I went into modeling because I love clothes and good food and shopping and travel and freedom and pleasure. This seems like a good proposition for any 21-year-old woman, and Dovima went on to explain her definition of prosperity: it's having anything you want in life, whether it's material or not. Everything is an indulgence. This trait was clear in the entire duration of her career, despite the fact that she happily provided for her family and was a renowned philanthropist. Dovima prodigately spent her money. It was this kind of attitude shared with the rest of the Western world that suggests that to go over the top is the best way to be. Dovima lived through fashion's golden age and its metamorphosis from handcrafted luxury to a commercial global industry. It's hard to imagine that in 1947 the fashion industry was nowhere near as vast as it is now, with New York lagging behind European dominance. Couture was an exclusive luxury available only to the world's elite and was often subsidized by the designer's own wealth. During the 1950s, ready-to-wear collections became very popular, and Parisian couturiers began to capitalize on their creations through licenses, with companies producing things like perfume, nylons, and accessories. This was a critical point in the commercialization of fashion and a cornerstone in the making of the multi-billion-dollar global industry we see today. Dovima became the first ever true supermodel, and though she began her career right at the end of the golden age, her modeling epitomized the grace and sophistication now only recognizable in the likes of fine art portraits. Dovima began earning good money once her modeling career took off. She began doing beauty ads for various companies and high fashion shoots for well-known magazines like Harper's Bazaar, Life, and Vogue. It is estimated that at the peak of her career, Dovima was earning anywhere between $150,000 and $350,000 a year. At the time of her death, her salary had declined to a meager $12,000 per year. During the height of her career, Dovima became accustomed to a life of dining in expensive restaurants and taking lavish vacations. This was a very big change from her previous life as a struggling model, barely able to put food on the table for her and her children. Unfortunately for Dovima, these days would not last long. When Dovima began pursuing a career in fashion modeling at the age of 20, she was living in a small, one-room apartment spending $30 a week for groceries. Within the course of the next 7 years, Dovima would dramatically increase her income and standard of living, only to completely lose all the money she earned, and then some. To someone that doesn't fully understand Dovima's situation or financial status at its peak, it looks as though she was being careless and spending her little money on unnecessary luxuries. This is not the case. What happened here is an extreme case of lifestyle inflation. Dovima's spending habits were also a result of loneliness, an act either to gain attention or fill the gap left by her husband's ill-timed passing. Adults held their own birthday parties at Tiffany's, complete with doggy bags and diamond-studded collars. Accustomed to her 5-hour daily dressing rituals, she wore a fresh nightgown every day, and the aid of a lady's maid continued up to her hospitalization. Often Dovima was blackmailed by friends or family to lend or give money as the only means to keep them near, and it came at an unfortunate irony that it lended her brother money to marry. The price now lies on her son. Although extravagant living was the norm for high earners in the 50s, Dovima's spending habits were far beyond what her income or status could sustain. During her modeling years, Dovima's substantial income was spent as quickly as it was earned. Expenditure ranged from renting limousines for a day but only using them to drive around the block, to throwing out an entire wardrobe to dash across the street to buy the latest fashions. Her life was often described as a Cinderella story, as she would wake up each morning to a delivery of fresh flowers at her door, only to end at midnight when her grandfather pulled up in a limousine to bring her home. Her magic pumpkin. Dovima made several personal investments, which included a charity boutique. In early 1970, she invested around $40,000 in a new boutique in Manhattan, which was backed by the Association for the Help of Retarded Children. She provided them with a loan after they failed to receive a charitable grant. Unfortunately, the boutique failed and costs of over $70,000 were accumulated. The boutique's failure was due to a poorly chosen location, as it was tucked away in a side street off 5th Avenue, no advertising, and it failed to attract enough volunteer helpers. The investment ended with Dovima having to donate a further $30,000 from her own pocket to cover the costs. When the lease on her home in East 93rd Street expired in 1973, she made a shocking decision. Believing she was going to live in Florida permanently, she sold her townhouse in Manhattan for $100,000 and spent a staggering $600,000 in building a new house in Florida, only to realize that she was not satisfied with life in the USA and wanted to move to Spain. This resulted in her selling her Florida home and moving to Spain in 1974, where she found serenity living in a rented apartment. Unfortunately, it was then that she decided to try and purchase property in Spain, and she found a house that she was fond of, which was on sale for $135,000. Using the money she made from the sale of the home in Florida and borrowing $100,000, she purchased the house in March 1975. Lee is still concerned about his mother's outlook on financial planning. He was caught off guard by her attitude towards the tribe's financial situation and their ability to protect their wealth as they age. The downfall of Dovima from wealth to poverty can be attributed to two factors: her self-philosophy and external factors. Lee's mother had a negative mindset towards aging, which caused her to not focus on the future. According to Olsen, Dovima's failure made her only think about today and treat the money she received as endless. This philosophy aligns with the life cycle hypothesis, which states that people will spend their income with tomorrow's income and borrow money if they are jobless. Dovima and her husband spent money as if there were no problems with their future and did not care about their investments. On the other hand, her husband never protested against his wife's bad behavior and remained silent. This caused Dovima to become more aggressive in her spending habits, as there was no objection and more money was carelessly spent by her husband. Dovima also forgot that money should be saved and protected from unwanted incidents. She always believed that the money would be there no matter what happened. In reality, she needed to consider the uncertainty of income during aging and unexpected future medical expenses. This led Dovima to have no liquid assets and all her money was spent. However, in addition to Dovima's self-philosophy, there were also factors that led her to ignore insurance mechanisms and all aspects of financing and lending, which ultimately led to her poverty. Her sister Dorothy was also said to have been part of a throng of people who would follow Dovima around and take advice from her on just about anything. She was astounded to find that her sister had hidden problems from her and said she would have been more than willing to return the favor. This event would make Dovima build up an even better relationship with her kids in future years, trying to keep them under a watch that her sister did not. Her new life took a quick turn for the worse due to personal tragedy. She lost her sister to a lifelong battle with anorexia. She was also dealing with a troubled marriage which would end in a divorce and lead her to lose custody of her two children. She believes this is around the time it all started to change for her. It wasn't because of the divorce, it was the untimely death of her sister. For me, the image that is electric in my mind is my sister's death. The loss of her mother in 1969 was the hardest blow that Dovima ever had to endure. Her mother was her role model, her strength, the woman who drove her into modeling and showed her that she must be as strong and independent as she was. Dovima stated, "When I lost her, I lost my touch with life." She continued to live in her mother's apartment, paying rent and taking care of it as if her mother was still living there. In 1974, now living off of the money from her mother's inheritance, Dovima's despair was compounded by the deaths of her uncle and her only brother, who died in a car accident. She described her brother as a bright rose who hadn't opened yet, and the pain was almost unbearable for her. His death was a turning point in her life and was in part the cause of the divorce with her third husband. He felt that Dovima was no longer able to maintain her stability and was not emotionally capable of helping to raise his daughter from a previous marriage. She cursed herself for a long time, feeling that once again she had lost her role as a good mother. With very little money coming from her inheritance, Dovima was now finding it hard to support herself. She felt stranded on the street, and in 1975 she moved into a tiny room at the YWCA. Her marriage ended later on with her ex-husband having and losing custody of his daughter. This was the first time in Dovima's modeling career that she had ever truly been alone, and she could no longer whisk away her pain with frequent traveling. After preparing herself for a future of battling pain and fatigue, she was struck a devastating blow. I believed I could contain my symptoms because I was looking forward to retirement from modeling in a few years. Now I fear I will not have a job that can enable me to support myself. Lakeside volunteered to stay the winter in a mud house in France with 10 different models, essentially making it so she would have to pay no rent. Recently, she grew to become badly disillusioned with the modeling industry and made the tough decision to retire. In 2009, she met her husband Glenn and his two daughters, and she eventually learned some hard lessons about health. She agreed to do a photo shoot in California with a widely known fashion photographer, taking the plane down to La. I was in a lot of pain. I got into a wheelchair and then was pushed onto the plane. At the shoot, I had to have another model lend me a hand to stand. Wixa was never a really healthy girl, but she never gave up modeling and she kept dealing with the pain. I would work and go away numerous times because I was experiencing such severe ache and fatigue. No one ever knew, she says. The baby boom generation was coming of age and wanted fashions that were more suited to younger persons. This boom generation wanted its own identity and clothing styles that were both similar to their parents and also different. There was now increased demand for clothes varied by situations, especially in the new workplaces, where dressing casually was becoming more and more acceptable. This ever-increasing demand for casual attire spurred employment in design. Also, the new rock and roll scene was sure to have an influence, with cool cats like the Beatles representing a style vastly different from that only a few years earlier. Tailored elegance was out, and youth was in. This would represent a significant shift in demand from Dovima's original look. The recent opening of ready-to-wear sections in the many department stores all over Europe and the commencement of the trade in copyrights and buying and selling of foreign ready-to-wear clothes have furthered these changes. It's hard to talk about Dovima without talking about fashion. Her work was entwined with the fashion industry, which was changing rapidly during the 1950s. In large part, these changes would contribute to her economic troubles. The fashion of the 1950s emphasized a long, slim, elegant female figure. This was epitomized by Dovima herself, and she would state that her look was the new look. However, fashions were changing. In the early to mid-60s, there was a wind of change in the air and a rebellion against all things establishment. New movements in art, music, and yes, fashion were aggressively seeking something different from what came before. Dovima's type of elegant and classy posing with a chic smile did not meet the requirements for the smiling cheerleader look. As the 60 seconds moved into the 1970s, the photogenic model would be typecast into regular cultural themes of the ethnic view, place, or time. A new brand of high fashion models would do public relations on location at different events around the world. These print ads would be successful in placement of any product due to the substantive sales increase on the product being advertised in the event or location of the ad and its correlation to the advertised product. The birth phase of the 1960s was a revolution in poetry, writing, music, and fashion. Changing beauty standards in the high fashion modeling industry started to create a distinction between classic, photogenic models and exotic models. If an exotic individual was to pursue a duty as a high fashion model, they would adopt the name Dovima. She was told it's not a name, it's a noise. The individual would be rejected to model in all sorts of high fashion clothing and jewelry due to the clothing details being the main focal point of high fashion photography at this time. The exotic model would be most confined to the public relations and runway duties of which there were now more of. Changes in fashion industry beauty standards came into full effect after black models such as Donna Luna and Naomi Sims, who called for changes in fashion industry standards. They were the first black models to appear on cover pages of mainstream American white female audience magazines. The reason for Dovima's displacement was far more complex than her age or the dating time. The fashion industry changed the way it presented the newest fashions. Dovima's strong point definition and facial features that had been the mainstay of the 50 seconds gave way to the natural looks of the 60 seconds. Photographers began to focus more on the natural light and the emotion of the model instead of staged studio shots, and they began to prefer shooting on location and in shorter modeling sessions. This was the antithesis of Dovima. Dovima had become established for her ability to change according to the light and style of fashion photography and to whims of various couturiers. Fast-paced photography and modeling on location did not suit the slowly aging Dovima, who was fast becoming more fragile due to her anorexia and depression, and modeling in the 60 seconds was less profitable for her. This change in fashion photography continues today and marks a fundamental change from the 50-second style that had suited Dovima so well. Dovima reigned supreme as a household name in the world of high fashion modeling for over a decade. Her delicate facial features, lean body and posture, her poise, elegance and confidence. Dovima was the epitome of a high fashion model, and it was her style that prevailed for so long in the fashion industry. But with the swinging 60s, the style of Dovima was to become old hat in the fast-paced, ever-changing world of fashion. Subsequent to this, Dovima engaged in a series of unfortunate circumstances that accelerated her demise into poverty and secured her place as a tragic narrative of society's crippling expectations on physical allure. Dovima's career ended in an acrimonious lawsuit against Revlon. Having lent her name and face to the company for nearly 20 years, she assumed her contract would be periodically renegotiated to ensure her financial security. What she did not anticipate was that Revlon's utmost concern was to employ beautiful models for minimal pay to broadcast their elite image, a point starkly contrasted by the generous terms offered to a specific group of male executives who had originally encouraged Dovima to represent the brand. In 1972, Revlon settled out of court, absolving Dovima of any confidentiality clauses and sneering that she would find no work in the future. To her dismay, this statement was true. Photographers, art directors, and designers with whom Dovima had shared deep friendships no longer wanted to associate themselves with a failed model. Eileen Ford did not renew her contract, and Wilhelmina Cooper dropped her from the agency. Revlon's condemnation of Dovima extended to a specific blacklisting, implying to every major cosmetic company in New York that acquiring their competitors' ex-employees was unethical. Dovima was left unemployed, and there were no advertising sponsors remaining, save for a few loyal Japanese cosmetics brands. This was a cruel turn of fate for somebody who had stayed the pinnacle of their career for so long and with much success. Dovima had suffered from a shift in American society, and it was felt by everyone, but soon it caused her extreme pain. In the late 60s, the youth around the world started to rebel against rigid social customs. The Vietnam War, Black Power, women's liberation, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, student riots in France and Italy, and the Prague Spring challenging Soviet rule in Czechoslovakia marked '68. There was a generation gap. Tradition was being thrown out the window. Bought clothes from London were causing a major fashion shift in America. One day, driving home in the rain, a grey poodle jumped in front of Dovima's car and she accidentally killed it. This was a very bad omen, and it was soon realized when she received an unfounded lawsuit from a girl claiming $100,000 in damages from a whiplash injury suffered in an elevator from Dovima stepping suddenly when her poodle barked. The girl had a past history of mental illness, and the poodle had claimed no injury. This case was eventually settled out of court, but it went to show how Dovima's comfortable world was beginning to collapse. Dovima left for business in 1984, after essentially winning her child support and alimony legal battle. This effectively began her second career, as she divorced from her legal profession. She worked for Kleinberger Galleries at 958 Madison, which was owned by famous impressionist art dealer Elena Reduce. Elio befriended Dovima, and one day told her that she was going to leave her business to work for the late movie director, John Huston. John was Errol Flynn's last roommate, and Dovima worked for him doing artwork commissions for his friends and his Santa Catalina home. She was only able to acquire promises of a monthly paycheck, but when she attempted to collect it, all of her work was seized and sold to pay off his medical debts. She then decided to go back to galleries on a commission basis, but Elio had left to live in Mexico in faction with John Huston, who had fired her. Dovima went back to Kleinberger's associates to earn a living and create a name for herself in the art industry, honing her skills for the next 4 years. A combination of several factors, onsets of her life are evident until her entrance into corporate sales. She grew up in the Bronx, from a well-off family during the Great Depression, and even so, she was able to attend private schools her whole life until she moved to Vermont. Art school had not prepared her directly for employment drawing, painting, and her primary means of income had been unskilled labor. This all made it tough to leave advertising and enter art. Also, the death of her mother led her to move around a bit amongst a couple of jobs, and thus her career shift was rather drawn out. In her 81st year, Dovima experienced a more severe economic downturn when reckless investment counselors took advantage of her ignorance and inexperience, not to mention her innate refinement, and talked her into high-risk commodity trading on the futures exchange. After 2 years of over-the-counter trading and predictably large losses, still hoping against hope for some final stroke of good fortune, she carelessly signed away the securities account that held all her investments for a bogus home loan, thus losing the remaining value of the investments, with half the value of the investments wiped out in the first year, by which time she, having the inclination but neither the leisure nor the training to follow a complex market, realized too late the disastrous misjudgment. She became uncharacteristically irritable, anxious, and withdrawn as mental torments deprived her of sleep and manic depression set in. Family support was now at an absolute minimum, and though the commodious, elegant apartment and her own and family home in Jamaica were retained, an eventual move to a smaller apartment with partial sale of most cherished antiques and collectibles proved inevitable. She also disposed of some jewelry and art objects to a dealer at unfavorable prices. Further losses in the following year halved the annual income. In 1986, wishing to live in less oppressive tax circumstances and still with hope of recovering considerable losses, and with the added attraction of being able to further her interests in art and music, she moved to Rome, where she remained until 1993. Dovima and her family were now residing in a 4-room unheated apartment in Yorkville, a poverty-stricken part of Manhattan. It was in these desperate years that they had to resort to any job they could get to survive. Dovima's mother was an apartment seeker finding a fairly decent 2-bedroom apartment on 97th and 3rd Avenue. Dovima had to work as an elevator girl and switchboard operator while attending the prestigious Julia Richmond High School. She never told anyone at her school that these were the type of jobs she was occupying. She felt ashamed, and this despondency in her early 20s caused no photos of this period to ever surface. Those who worked with Dovima during these years never knew her as a famous model. Her beauty was much too extraordinary for anyone to believe she was an ordinary person with ordinary problems, so they thought there was something wrong, that perhaps she was mentally sick. Dovima's pay at these jobs was very low, and she never once complained to anyone she worked with or for. She needed the money, and she held her head high during these menial positions. Dovima struggled with every decision she made to help her current situation. Her attempt at psychic readings for people was a sign of her desperation, as she did not believe in it and would be overwhelmed with guilt for taking money from vulnerable people who were desperate for advice and to get out of their situations. Her job as a singing telegram girl was interrupted by a marriage to Alan Murray Elkin, which blocked her attempt to work for 5 years due to his disapproval of the line of work. She only had one telegram remaining to pay a debt and signed it to him on their 1965 wedding anniversary. Dovima's initial encounter with falling into lower economic classes was forced upon her when she finally had to sell her family heirlooms, including her $30,000 wedding ring, to pay off her luxury rent. To cope with her loss, Dovima initially tried to gain an inheritance. When this was not possible, she turned to alternative plans. Dovima made attempts at making a career as a psychic on the California Blue Line train, then as a singing telegram girl. These odd jobs were not enough to prevent her from being evicted from her apartment after she defaulted on her rent and did not have enough to pay it off. These experiences were her first introduction to poverty and became a sign of what was to come. This entry into a lower economic class is the start of her financial problems that continued throughout the rest of her life. During the last years of her life, Dovima lost 2 homes and was evicted one more time before finding her final address in a retirement home for actors in Inglewood, New Jersey. Dovima works at a pizza parlor as a waiter and is very embarrassed by his evening job because he comes into contact with people whom he used to know and also students of his. He is so self-conscious that he sometimes wants to disappear. Even the students with whom he has some good-natured banter and jokes find it difficult to conceal their surprise at finding him in such humble surroundings. Dovima does his best to dress as immaculately as any waiter in a smarter establishment and always wears a grey lounge suit to work. He grudges every penny that he spends but has long ago reached the conclusion that it is impossible to save anything for a rainy day. Dovima becomes seriously ill with an ulcer and is forced to take a week off work. He is aghast when he realizes that in his absence he has been replaced by the manager's wife and that he no longer has a job. This incident and his subsequent stay in the hospital by the ward sister with the way he used to live make him decide to quit his present way of life as quickly as possible. He turns down the job of minding a rich friend's garden for the summer and decides that he must resume some form of private teaching. Dovima was never able to adapt to her changing circumstances. She was always living in the past. When the modeling profession turned her down due to aging, she could not accept it. After the loss of her jewels and paintings, she continued to try and live the luxurious high life by moving to different hotels and apartments that she could not afford and never staying in the same place for long. Dovima had lost any roots she had laid down. Living in poverty, it is evident that situations change for the worse. People will have to adapt to survive. Unfortunately for Dovima, it was easier said than done, and in the end, she was never able to climb out of poverty. This is a similar case for many elderly people who have never had to experience sudden life-changing events. The most important lesson learned is the value of financial literacy. At a young age, many people, including myself, choose to ignore learning useful skills and information involving basic finance. When Dovima was making money, she made no thought of saving it. In her mind, she would always be making that sort of money, so there would be no need for compromising her lifestyle. In the future, students need to be educated about basic knowledge, including budgeting, taxes, and putting money into savings accounts. This way, if circumstances do change, an individual will not struggle as much as Dovima did to get by. 6 months ago, Dovima knew nothing about budgeting, saving, or investing. She paid her bills and spent the rest of her money freely. She might have still ended up in the same situation that she is in now, but she might not have. The point is, she will never know because Dovima did not have a financial plan. A financially literate person would have a plan for the unexpected. They would have an emergency fund to avoid increased debt and increased stress. If Dovima had some saved money, do you think she would have had to attend that dinner to avoid a guilt trip from her boss? Would she have waited till the last minute on an overseas job opportunity? Would she have taken on that teaching job? Any one of these decisions could have been different. Dovima would not have taken the first decision she could find to get out of debt. She would have been able to be more selective. She would not have level jumped into a more stable career that she hated. Had Dovima been acting according to a financial plan, her situation would have been a lot different. A financially literate person also considers the long-term effects of their financial decisions. They are less concerned with imprudent desires for instant gratification. Case in point, if I had any common sense, I would have spent less time being a glamazon, saving like a banshee, and fighting the urge to be in the spotlight. Dovima enjoyed her time in the fashion industry, but it was not a smart long-term career choice. After discussing this disaster over with a former colleague from my fashion industry days, she said, "Well, it's a good thing you got out when you did. It's mindless work, and there's just no security. I don't have a pot to tinkle in." Dovima knew that the industry was unstable, yet she never considered what would become of her if one day she found herself unable to model. She had not been investing in herself. A financially literate person would have considered owning a home, retirement, and the ability to provide for themselves and or their family with children's higher education and an acceptable standard of living. At this moment, Dovima does not know what her future holds. She possesses no set skills or career other than modeling. Her finances are a wreck and she has no one else to rely on to pull her out. Once you are living with very little by contemporary Western standards, the system is against you. With little to no savings, Dovima found it nearly impossible to find a decent place to live. In the United States, people living on the margin spend more than 30% of their income on rent. Many low-income people spend 50% on rent on substandard housing in terrible neighborhoods. Going from place to place and spending all her energy trying to secure a safe place to live, the first thing she had to do was adapt to her changing circumstances. She began to sell her designer clothes and accessories, which were a symbol of her glamorous past, in exchange for clothes that would blend in, seemingly altering her identity overnight. She also did some modeling work and took potential suitors a tad more seriously than she would have otherwise. She had to start thinking about how to survive from day to day, which was a wealth of knowledge she will find invaluable. This was indeed trading one existence for another. Without money, it is hard to participate in free outdoor events, as these are often in dangerous neighborhoods and transportation or parking can cost money. One of the first activities Dovima missed was strolling through museums and galleries where she supported herself in her early days by doing sketching and illustration. She found that the paintings and sculptures are unwitting symbols of an elitist culture, with no real relevance to those on the bottom. So often the work depicts the struggle of the poor and uses them as subject matter, but the poor are not able to partake. This was a hard pill to swallow, certainly not one to be subservient. Dovima had to swallow her immense pride and make some difficult choices. Examples of this include giving up her independence and moving back home, a decision which was later to have profound repercussions in more ways than one. She had to learn to mix with people who were not her intellectual equals and some that were of dubious character. All these choices were made to maximize the chance of improving her lot in life. There were times when the improvement seemed questionable at best. Dovima's haphazard approach to making friends and building relationships have played a key role in her change in circumstances from the hills of Hollywood to a small apartment in the Bronx. In order to escape from poverty, Dovima now had to use her relationship skills to form alliances with people who could assist her. Easier said than done. In conclusion, the story of Dovima, from her rise to fame as an iconic supermodel to her eventual downfall, is a poignant tale of glamour, success, and the harsh realities of life. Despite her humble beginnings and the challenges she faced, Dovima's impact on the fashion industry was profound. Her journey serves as a stark reminder of the transient nature of fame and fortune. It underscores the importance of resilience, the value of personal identity beyond public persona, and the human side of glamour that often remains hidden behind the camera's lens. Dovima's story is not just a narrative of downfall, but also a testament to the enduring spirit of a woman who once stood at the pinnacle of the fashion world.